Good afternoon and welcome to the Council. I'm your host, Charlie Pacello, and we've got a great show for you today. So excited to introduce my guest here in just a few moments. I just want to do a quick shout out to our sponsor, RE/MAX Alliance. RE/MAX Alliance, if you want to buy a home in Colorado, you want to buy your dream home or sell your home, these are the people to go to. Go to www.homesincolorado.com. That's homesincolorado.com. These guys are fantastic. I've known them for a very long time. They have integrity. They have character. They want to help you to find your dream home. Go to these guys and look them up. Tell them I sent you, and they're going to work their butts off for you. Go to www.homesincolorado.com. That's RE/MAX Alliance. Also, I want to offer to all of you who are listening to this from all over the world. I want to give you an opportunity to send me your problems, send me your issues. I want to be able to help you. I'm giving away a 15-minute free consultation to work with me. I will help you. I'll solve your problems. Send to my email at charlespacello.com. That's CHARLES. P as in Peter, ACELLO at gmail.com. Put in the subject line, help me, Charlie. And for 15 minutes, we'll have a free consultation. I will help you to solve your problems. This offer is available until December 25th. So if you're watching this afterwards and this is something that you need, this offer is up until Christmas. And, it is something that I'm passionate about. We've talked about a lot of different topics on the show. Talked about divorce, talked about making better choices, how to make those empowered choices, any kind of trauma issues, anything that I can do to help you to recover and to get back with your life. Please contact me at charlespacello.com. That's CHARLESPACELLO at gmail.com. And in the subject line, help me, Charlie. Today, we are talking about a veterans homecoming. And, this is one of the most important things that we sometimes miss as far as veterans coming back from combat or trauma, the wars that they've experienced, and being able to welcome them back into the community. It is such an important aspect, and they're often left alone to figure out how to do it themselves. And one of the organizations that I work with, and that Dr. Brooke with me, who is the president of the organization, Soldier's Heart, is that we try to help our veterans who haven't been able to make that journey home to come back home again. And one of the things about a veterans homecoming is we're going to be transformed by these experiences. And we've got to look at people in our history who've been able to successfully make that transition, that transition from being a servant of Ares, which is a servant of the god of war, to a servant of Athena, which is the one who protects and shields and only uses war as a last result. But I want to point someone out to you that I think really exemplifies someone who experienced war and made a profound contribution to the world and to how he was able to make his war wounds and turn it into something good. And that was St. Francis of Assisi. Francis of Assisi was born in Italy in 1182 to Pietro de Bernardone and Lady Pica. His mother was a beautiful woman from the south of France. And young Francis, he lived a life of luxury. He had everything. He was spoiled. He indulged in lavish parties. He drank lots of wine. He serenaded young girls at night. He merrily passed his days in excess and debauchery. And Francis was a natural leader. People followed him. And he loved to sing and he loved to tell jokes. And he was robust and he was life-affirming in nature. And he had this vivid, joyous, colorful person who drank up the nectar of life's sweet pleasures and free from any responsibility or cares or concern for the welfare of others. And when war broke out in 1202 between the city-states of Assisi and Perugia, Francis caught up in the fever pitch of war. He wanted to show he wanted to be in the glory of it and become a knight and the chivalry and the sense of duty to his native city and the opportunity to prove his courage in the face of battle. And Francis was one of the first to take up arms. And after all was said and done, Perugia defeated Assisi in the war, and Francis, a lot of people don't know this, was captured by the enemies and taken prisoner. Now, fortunately for us, he wasn't killed, but he was held for a high ransom and kept in a dark, damp dungeon for almost a year. Francis survived beatings, torture, and he lived in perpetual darkness for almost a year. And he endured the horrors and trials of being a prisoner of war. He caught a severe case of malaria and was forced to turn inward to find the stamina and the courage to continue on. And in that dark, rodent-infested chamber that was his prison cell, Francis examined his life, only to discover the pointlessness and meaninglessness of it all. And that year as a prisoner of war changed him. The family cloth business, the life of a playboy, the delusions of the glory of war had all disappointed this young man. And when the ransom was finally paid, the young Francis was not the same man. Like many veterans today, when they come home, well, like Francis did, he returned to a place that felt very alien to him, even though it was his ancestral home. Now, the people of Assisi had virtually stayed the same. He had not. And that is such a typical thing for a veteran to feel, that everybody has stayed the same, whereas I've changed. And those invisible wounds that he carried from his experiences in the war would eventually compel Francis to seek out a deeper meaning of life beyond appearances, a quest that would ultimately transform him into one of the greatest spiritual warriors for peace. Now, he was one of my heroes. When I got confirmed in the Catholic Church, Francis was the name that I took. I just loved what Francis of Assisi was all about. He was a mystic. He talked about things that were above it wasn't just about being a Catholic. It was about loving all of life. And his kindliness, his sincerity, his genuineness, his simplicity, his authentic devotion to Christ-like principles, and his purity and commitment to serving a higher cause, to serving God. Francis loved everybody. He loved the trees, he loved the flowers, he loved the plants, he loved the animals. He implored that we set aside our greed, our anger, our hatred, and build instead a society where we truly loved one another as our brother. And he exemplified that supreme unconditional love. And he served the poor, he served the needy, he served the sick. And he had a purity of heart that was untainted by the avarice, the lust for power and greed, the violence and selfishness of his time. And as a young man, I didn't know all this stuff about St. Francis. When I picked his name, I had no clue that he was also a veteran. And when I suffered from my moral trauma and the trauma and the moral injury that I experienced, I disavowed God, and I turned my whole life. I became pretty much an agnostic or an atheist. And it wasn't until I reached my crisis point that I turned back and became connected back to Francis and realized our intimate connection that we both shared. So Francis was alienated, isolated. He was withdrawn. His father, Pietro, wanted him to take over the mercantile business. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. He was aimless. He was wandering around the countryside, immersing himself into nature. And then he came upon this dilapidated church, and that's when he heard the voice of Jesus and said to him, Francis, rebuild my church. And so he decided to repair this little church and built it back up again from the stones. He sold some of his father's clothes. He stole them in order to purchase the tools and the mortar for the building. And his father got very upset. He was in a rage over all this stuff. He couldn't understand what was happening with his son. His son was singing and preaching in the center of Assisi and making a fool of himself. And Pietro decided that he wanted to disown his son, to disown Francis, that he was a disgrace to him, disgrace to the family name, and he declared in front of the bishop and the whole city that Francis was no longer his son. And all eyes turned towards Francis to see what he was going to do next. And Francis was really dressed beautifully. He had those beautiful clothes that they had at that time. And he moved towards the center. And before anyone could stop him, He disrobed all of his clothes. Francis, in that moment, renounced his allegiance to his father in front of all of Assisi. And he was standing naked there before the entire world. And this gesture symbolized his renouncement of this commercial, greedy, violent, selfish, warmongering world of his earthly father. And he was no longer going to be defined or identified as the heir to a mercantile legacy, which deified money and power above love and compassion and social justice for other people, for the poor, the sick, and the needy. And from that moment on, he would serve a higher cause, devoting his life to these principles of perfect patience, poverty, simplicity, chastity, and love. Now, when we examine the life of St. Francis, we discover that there is a path, here's a path to becoming a peaceful warrior. It's just one path. And all warriors can relate to this. It follows the same hero's journey articulated by the late Joseph Campbell. We heard the call to glory. We heard the call to serve, to our duty and honor in defending the people of our nation. We're confronted with the terror, the horror, and the brutalities that we see in war, which shatters our innocence and covers us up with the sins of immortal crimes. And consequently, we lose our connection, to the sanctity of life. And we're filled with all this grief and this rage and this despair and total hopelessness as we're trapped in this underworld. And we are disillusioned by the entrapments of the world. Commercialism, our love of war, the rage against those who profit off the deaths of innocent and our brothers and sisters. The frustration over what war does to people and the public's blindness to the truth. The moral outrage of the avariciousness, the lust, and the perpetration by the powerful to control the hearts and minds of people through distortions and lies. And the exasperation felt by the petty trivialities of what people are concerned about, what they cling to in their day-to-day lives. They don't know how precious life is. And so these are some of the truths that warriors have to face and what they're looking at and walking around aimlessly trying to find that. And it can be a very lonely odyssey that a lot of veterans go through. And usually there's a lot of tests and obstacles that veterans have to face when they come home. And it can, without any kind of guidance, it can lead to teetering on the edge of their own existence. What happens is our initiation is not done. We've got to complete that. We've got to identify, we've got to integrate, we've got to assimilate those characteristics of the warrior archetype with the virtues and values of those sacred principles. And we've got to have that clarity of thinking and discernment, that proper aggressiveness in maintaining peace and concord, and our ability to evaluate circumstances in the moment, and combine that with courage and fearlessness and an unconquerable spirit, with the recognition of the interconnectedness of all of life. You know, science is proving this. You just do a little research into quantum physics, you'll notice that everything is interconnected, and the discoveries there that are being made are really profound truths. And above all, peaceful warriors are loyal to a cause greater than themselves. The right for every human being to live in this world with peace and justice and harmony. And even if you don't believe in God, you can understand this. The fact that you can establish a sense of compassion for every person's right to exist while doing your duty. And this can be accomplished. How do we do this? How do we enact this? This can be accomplished by directing that energy to preserving, protecting, and honoring all life. And through those cultivation of those moral and ethical virtues of courage and kindness and benevolence, fortitude, selfless service, and caring for the plight of others, channeling that warrior energy towards restitution, reconciliation, and rebuilding efforts for those war-torn countries where those memories still haunt the people. A commitment of all nations to put down the sword of Ares and pick up the shield of Athena. Using war only as a last resort when all other means have been exhausted, and there's a definite, verifiable threat to the lives of the citizens of the country. And most importantly, the cause must be noble and just. There's no question we must stand up to evil. And lastly, we can teach others, even our enemies, how to love one another, because when we understand the preciousness and fragility of life, we can learn to be able to live together in this world. And we do this in small ways every day. For example, we extend a hand of truce rather than challenging a person to fight. We engage the community and build things together. We enact and participate in cross-cultural activities to learn more about each other. We put down our arms and demand constructive, peaceful solutions to our collective problems. And we cultivate the mindset of working together rather than against each other for the common good. All these and more are practical expressions of brotherly love elder warriors can embrace and inaugurate in the years to come. And you don't have to be a monk or a priest or a rabbi or a guru or become like someone like St. Francis and become celibate and renounce all the pleasures of life to become an elder warrior and a peaceful warrior. What is necessary is to understand and to take the passion that St. Francis had for all of life, a life so dear to his heart, and make it so dear to our hearts, and that we wish for all peoples all over the world to share in the joy and rapture of the supreme ecstasy we call existence. Now, I want to introduce to you one of the most incredible men I've actually had the privilege to meet. I met Dr. Brooke this summer at the Soldiers Heart Institute, where we taught for a wonderful gathering of people. And I had a chance to sit down with him and talk to him about his experiences, and he made an incredible presentation, and I'm just so honored that he's here to be on this show. Dr. Roger Brooke is going to help us to dive even deeper into this understanding into the Veterans Homecoming. He is a professor of psychology at Duquesne University, where he is also a director of the Military Psychological Services. He is a board-certified clinical psychologist and is the current residing president of Soldiers Heart. Dr. Brooke, thank you for joining us today here on the Council.
Hi, thank you for having me, and please call me Roger. You know, I was a private Brooke, so I'm very happy in my lowly lot in life.
Well, you may think I was a lowly lot in life, but we had an opportunity out there in Saratoga Springs to be able to sit together and have a wonderful evening after one of the day's presentations, and I just found you to be one of the most incredible and thoughtful, wise men that I had ever had the privilege to meet. And I just would love for you to be able to share a little bit about your background and how you became and what motivated you to become a psychologist.
I shall. Do you mind if I start where you ended off with St. Francis? Because there's a great story, your story is a segue. Your account of St. Francis is a segue into our further conversation, which is about him as a veteran warrior and not just as a saint. Some of your viewers might know that even in the early years of St. Francis, a legend grew up that there was a wolf that had become a man-eater and was eating people in the town of Gubbio. And the villagers were going to go out and form a posse to go and kill the wolf. And St. Francis said, no, you don't need to do that. I've tamed the wolf, or I can go out and tame this wolf. You don't need to kill it. And that is, in fact, what St. Francis did. He went to the wolf and he said, you've got to stop eating people. We'll feed you pizza or whatever the heck they fed him, but we'll feed you, and you've got to start eating people. And they made a deal. What I think is so inspiring about the story is that if we think of what the wolf is in European mythology, the wolf was a placeholder for everything that was evil, malevolent, unhuman or inhuman, dangerous, and vile. What the wolf was in European mythology is what our veterans now call the beast. And I like to think that St. Francis was able to tame the wolf because he had met the beast. And therefore his ability to tame the wolf and that social function of taming the wolf that could tear to pieces a community, that social function was not just because of his line to God or the sacred, but also because he was a veteran.
I think that's such an important part too. It's that beast within that every veteran has to deal with, has to face. And,
Yeah.
it is if we're not making friends with the beast and understanding and taming that wolf within us, it will propel us. It becomes a propellant, and it drives and it excites, and it just takes something outside of us to trigger that. And if we're not being able to tame that within us, I think that's such a wonderful metaphor. To put our own darkness on the cross. For another example, since we're here in the Christian terminology, that it can consume us and overwhelm us when we come back home. Is it something that drove you to becoming a psychologist?
I think that most of us who became psychologists, particularly psychotherapists, find that our motivations and origins reach into obscurity. Many of us will admit that we started our training when we were about 3. What I will say is that I've always been drawn to finding words for the unspeakable, and I've been drawn to I've always had a kind of an empathy and a sort of I'm drawn to the edges of human experience and of suffering.
Well, you were in the military, right? When you're from South Africa, and
correct.
You were in the service there, so you certainly have a prime experience of the whole journey that a veteran has to go through. So, could you just talk a little bit about your military experience there in South Africa? I mean, you've said some amazing stories.
Well, I think the brief version is that as a young white man finishing high school, I was simply drafted. There was 100% draft for young white men leaving high school, and you went off and joined the army, and you didn't think much about it. I volunteered for training in one parachute battalion, partly to impress my girlfriend, which it didn't, and partly because of the challenge. And I did have the advantage of having served in an extraordinarily elite unit. I think the other thing so I understand military culture. I'm not a combat veteran. Most of the war in Angola and so on happened after I had left the army. So I'm not a combat veteran, but I did the training and I served in a unit that in fact saw a lot of combat after I had left it. I understand military culture, and it left its mark on my life. In fact, a couple of years ago, I phoned an old sergeant of mine, a sergeant, he was known as Snakes, Sergeant Snakes Sneeman. And it was something of an impulse, but I found his phone number, and I said to him that there was something I wanted to say. When he answered the phone, I will say I recognized that voice, and it still made me go cold. But I told him that I didn't think of him every day, but that there hadn't been a day in my life when he was not on the horizon of my world as an example and as a requirement, and that he had made me a better man. The other thing I'll say about my experience, especially being South African, is that I think I experienced a lot of the contradictions that many, particularly Vietnam-era American military folks feel, which is a significant pride in being in a remarkable unit, but also quite conflicted and about the politics and all that sort of thing. And so I've sort of been all over the place. I'm a paratrooper. My personal political philosophy is probably based more on Mahatma Gandhi than non-violent action. And, I'm a kind of a liberal, and I was a white South African paratrooper, and I am kind of this massive contradictions, which I do think of myself actually as patron saint of contradictions. Wherever you are, I'm there too.
Well, I feel the same way. That bond that you have with the guys and the gals that you serve in the military with there's a certain bond that you have just because, it transcends, it goes beyond any kind of politics that you may have. You're willing to sacrifice to give your life for somebody else, for your brother, for your sister, and that's only a few people around the world. I think it's a very small percentage, maybe 1% of the population who ever really understands what that is and that kind of profound love that you have for them. Even if you don't call it that, it's something really unique. And, you don't have to have any kind of political ideology that defines that. It goes well beyond that. You can associate and understand the need and for that kind of depth of feeling that you have for your brothers and sisters in arms. And I also am a contradiction as well as you I understand the dynamics of one side. I understand I'm also leaning more towards Mahatma Gandhi and nonviolent aggression, only using it when necessary and absolutely necessary. Because I understand how, just from being on this side, what the cost is on the other end. What the cost is to the souls of the people who come back, and how detrimental how it ripples across families and generations and cultures. And if we're not addressing those things, these things perpetuate and continue on generation after generation.
Charlie, what I think your viewers might be interested in is the question of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, and those so-called invisible wounds of war. One of the sort of myths out there, in a negative sense of myths, is that PTSD is a sort of a new phenomenon, and it's because people are soft or something, and it's simply not true. The psychological wounds of war that we now call PTSD have been named and ritually addressed in all traditional warrior cultures around the world and through history. The earliest account that I could find was from the Indian subcontinent in the ancient script, the Mahabharata, which is over 5,000 years old and describes how the hero Jayadratha lost his moral bearings. That he kidnapped and raped a princess, and the gods were displeased and killed him. We find the psychological wounds of war running through what we Christians call the Old Testament. The book of Samuel is a litany of post-traumatic misery. The life of Saul, for example, it's described how a dark and evil spirit descended on him. He became paranoid, murderous, depressed, and he ended in suicide. When his son Jonathan tried to persuade him that David was a loyal servant, he nearly had Jonathan killed. And 85 priests who once went to Saul to represent David, he had them executed. His life was a mess, and David's was traumatized as well. The Lakota Sioux called these wounds the Nagina Payape, which translates as the spirits have left him, describing that experience of feeling numb and vaguely depersonalized and cut off from the world, zombie-like, that so many veterans struggle with. And then across the world, in South Africa, the Xhosa called it the Kaneni, which is a particular kind of warrior's insight into what was described as the shadow that follows you around and never lets you forget what you've done. One of the problems of the diagnosis of PTSD for combat veterans is that it looks at what is sort of the physiological arousal and flashbacks and so on. That is common to all sorts of PTSD, from motor vehicle accidents to tsunamis and tornadoes and so on. And the problem with looking at what is similar is that it forgets and misses what is different and is essential about the deployment or the combat veterans' suffering, which is what we are now starting at last to call moral injury, discovering this ancient truth that the wounds of combat are primarily moral and spiritual. The term that you and I like so much was the American Civil War term, soldier's heart. We like it because it points directly to that moral and spiritual center of our lives. The other thing I would say is that when we understand combat PTSD as a human universal and not as a psychiatric illness, then that itself, that fundamental reframing is inherently transformative, because in all those traditional warrior cultures, the experience of combat and its so-called, what we call its trauma, was understood as an initiation onto a pathway of moral and spiritual development through the lifespan, which was known as the warrior's path, and was ritually endorsed and sanctioned and honored by the local community. So if we do that reframing with our veterans, they immediately are given a sense of dignity, that their suffering was shared with George Washington and Odysseus, who took 10 years to get back from the war, and his family didn't recognize him. And Sitting Bull, whose primary role was as a healer for his warriors. So the experience immediately has dignity, and secondly, it has developmental direction. One of the problems of the diagnosis of PTSD is not just the stigma for the individual concerned who's now told he has a psychiatric illness, with all the medical assumptions that go along with that, but it also completely marginalizes the person's family and local community, because they're not so-called mental health professionals who are trained to deal with what has now been, in quotes, called a mental illness. So the family becomes uncertain of their roles. Whereas if we take it out of the language of mental illness and understand it as an initiatory human universal, then the family and the local community and pastors and so on can all be empowered to help bring the veteran home.
Why do you think that was? I mean, it has happened that way, where they've actually taken, and you've articulated so beautifully this whole passage, this history, this connection to this universal wound. It's a universal. All these cultures from all these different civilizations have expressed it, have identified it. You can see it in the Bible. You can see it in the Mahabharata and all these other. You can read about it in letters from the Civil War era, and you can hear it in all these different types of this soldier's heart, of this deep wound that people feel. And yet somehow, some way, it got categorized and isolated into just this psychiatric diagnosis. That it was just, and it does change things to the brain. It does affect it and change the way the brain processes it. Why did it just get so isolated into that category and taken away from this universal understanding that the ancestors and others were trying to pass on to us?
Well, my answer is, I suppose, a little bit speculative and to do with what we call the sociology of knowledge, which is, I guess it was going back to the First World War, where shell shock was understood as a sort of a medical condition. The rise of science and medicine, materialism and biology, the decline of a spiritual understanding of human life, the rise of medicine, all those are significant factors. And more recently now, of course, we have the massive weight of the pharmaceutical industry. Right now, the pharmaceutical industry is spending hundreds of millions of dollars pushing for the diagnosis of PTSD to be spread around the world through Africa and its local communities and in China and so on. And these are not just medical diagnoses. These are what we call social constructions. These are our societies or ways of interpreting experience as a medical condition. And it's largely a marketing issue. I have colleagues right now who are very critical of the sort of what's called the language of trauma being marketed to local African communities, for example, who have been successfully dealing with trauma since time immemorial. But now, instead of their rituals and their understandings being honored and carrying on, they're persuaded that those are all sort of superstition, and to become modern they need to be scientific, and the people who are suffering have a medical condition, and it marginalizes the local community and voila, we can sell them hundreds of millions of dollars worth of pills.
Wow.
I'm rather cynical, but I don't mean to be cynical, but that's the truth of it.
Wow. And I think that's so important for this audience to hear, because many may have not heard that so clearly articulated before. Thank you. Just a quick radio announcement. You are listening to this fantastic interview with Dr. Roger Brooke here on KUHSdenver.com. That's KUHSdenver.com. We are broadcasting not only here in Colorado, but all across the nation and all across the world. We are having people tuning in from every continent, almost in so many different countries. I just want to honor and thank all of you for tuning in and listening to this program, the council. Without you, the show wouldn't be possible. So thank you very, very much. Roger, what is the meaning of combat experience and its aftermath in PTSD symptoms? Is there a purpose to it? What psychic function does it serve for the veteran?
That's really what a beautiful question. You know, this is where I would have to say that my training in the Jungian, the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung, the Jungian tradition is really helpful, that and the psychoanalytic tradition. Our training, the whole purpose of military training is to enable you to live through experiences competently without fully experiencing them. In other words, without experiencing them with the fullness of your humanity. In the middle of a firefight or when all hell breaks loose, if you had to experience what's happening with what I call the fullness of our humanity, you wouldn't be able to function. It would be overwhelming. And the whole purpose of training is precisely that you can live through that situation competently without experiencing it. So that's wonderful. But it does mean that later, I would say that all trauma is experienced or lived through twice. The first time we lived through the situation with a ferocious commitment to mission and team survival, which is even beyond one's own survival. And then often later, when we're at home or when it's safer and we can let our defenses down, then these memories and flashbacks and so on start pouring through. And I understand this really in the service of the recovery or the reclamation of our fuller humanity, where we, in these memories and feelings, we can experience. Am I still on live? It's got a poor connection.
Yeah, you're still on live.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where we can experience for the first time what was lived through without experience originally. I don't know if that made sense, if I should repeat that. It's that in afterwards we are then experiencing for the first time what was lived through without experiencing it fully originally. And we experiencing it for the first time in these memories and flashbacks and so on is in the service of the recovery of the fullness of our humanity. And that can be transformative. It often, if I can keep going, it often has a profoundly ethical dimension. For example, I have worked with so many veterans who have nightmares of the dead, or they are haunted, if you like, haunted by faces of the dead, which include the dead enemy or dead children in a combat zone. And there's no amount of alcohol or drugs that is ever going to be able to heal from that. But I think that we are experiencing the misery of those dead children and the shock of the dead enemy, which I remember one person said, you know, I always remember their faces and they know it's the last second of their lives. It was just haunted by the dead like that. I think that these images of the dead come back to us because we need to make peace with the dead. in all traditional warrior cultures, making peace with the dead is considered necessary for healing. You know how the Lakota Sioux and the Plains Indians, we used to see them on movies and so on, they'd kill an elk or something, or a buffalo, and they would pray for the spirit of the buffalo and give it thanks. What people don't know is that they used to pray like that and honor the spirit, the dead enemy as well, so that the dead enemy could go on to the next world. I've had many veterans from these recent wars. Finally, they will often just say, to these faces of the dead, I wish you well. Go to Allah. Sometimes they will pray for them. And in some way recognize the humanity of the dead, including the dead enemy. And in doing so, there's a strange kind of peace and settling down. The nightmares will frequently, in fact, nearly always stop. Sometimes there will be particular rituals that they will do, like on Memorial Day, we'll plant a tree in, say, the name of a little Vietnamese girl or a little Afghan girl or something like that, and then the veteran will talk to his own daughter or a niece or something and say, there was this little girl that I knew and she died, and let's pray for her. Mm-hmm. And in this way, in making peace with the dead, there's a very deep sense of peace. Sometimes there's an experience that these hauntings, these figures that haunt us in our dreams, in our nightmares, are sort of subtly transformed into being more like guardian angels. I was so touched when a man told me that he had come to pray for this little girl as a kind of an angel who could help him be a better father to his own daughter. For example, it was very touching.
That's reconnecting to our own sense of humanity after those kinds of experiences, and to make peace with the dead, to ritualize. These are the things that connect us to a wider perspective, a wider understanding of the interconnectedness and sacredness of all life and all things that need to be valued and honored and brought back into sacred union, brought back into a balance. The ancient Greeks used to also honor their dead as well, and they honor the dead of the people who actually, after they fought, after the battles of Troy, for example, they would, give days off so that they could bury their dead and memorialize them and honor those who fought on the field.
Can I interrupt?
Sure. Yeah.
Here's an interesting lesson from the Xhosa of South Africa. The Xhosa used to say that the warrior's soul is left on the battlefield, and that his own soul will not be returned to him until he has made peace with the dead. I was reminded of a veteran I met I remember reading about a Vietnam veteran who went to the Vietnam Wall to try and find his name. He wondered if he had been killed in Vietnam and simply hadn't realized it yet after all these years. And I remember a young veteran from Afghanistan who wondered if he had been killed in Afghanistan and hadn't realized it yet. And a psychiatrist had thought that this sounded like he was depressed and gave him an antidepressant, but it didn't help. And I thought of the Xhosa and how the Xhosa would understand it completely. Of course he thinks he's still on the battlefield, and that's because he hasn't made peace with the dead. And for the Xhosa, when you pray for the dead, including the enemy dead, then the ancestors, who are the carriers of the moral order of the world as a sort of a cosmos rather than as a chaos, the ancestors, as the carriers of this world as a moral order, will then be pleased that the moral order has been put together again, at which point they will allow the souls of the veterans to be returned to them so that they can take their souls back into the civilian community. And there are rituals there that the civilian community then participates in, which further takes brings the veteran home. And that is to do with storytelling. Do you want to say something about that?
No, I'd love for you. Yeah, this is fantastic. Wow.
Okay.
Amazing.
there's some wonderful writing about storytelling in veterans, including in Jonathan Shea's work and Ed Tex and so on. I think that storytelling is very interesting. We often come back from service or from combat with a kind of collage of images that don't really make much sense in terms of a story. And to put them into words and to tell a story is actually to speak, especially to civilians, is to put one's experience into one's mother tongue. And the mother tongue, where we then describe our experience and we say this was beautiful and this was funny and this was frightening and courageous and cowardly and that was betrayal and this was duty and this was painful. All this language is a language that puts the language of our mother tongue and the language of our community in an absolutely immediate way, brings our experience home. It puts our experience back together in a world as a fabric of stories and images and language. To go back to the Xhosa, some of your viewers might remember when South Africa had its transformation and Nelson Mandela became president. In the years after the end of apartheid, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was founded by Bishop Tutu, was a process. It was a commission in which people would go to the commission and they would talk about what they had done, where they had worked with security forces or other various splinter groups and so on, where they had killed people and buried them. And they would confess to this commission, but they would also do so in front of the families of those that they had killed.
I bet that was very powerful.
It was an extraordinary achievement. Now, many people think that the commission was flawed and that think justice wasn't completely served. But it did have a remarkable social function, and what not many people realize is how this extraordinary cultural phenomenon came out of the Xhosa tradition of the ukabula, or at least it was consistent with this tradition of the ukabula, which was the process in which warriors would tell their stories, and they would confess their sins, if you like, to the local community. And the local community's task was to stay present and to bear witness, no matter how painful it was. And in this way, they would take responsibility for the violence that had been done in its name.
It's such an important thing.
Profoundly healing.
Yeah. Well, and that's the whole idea of being able to share stories within the communities, within the families. When these stories are not shared, there's a disconnect from that process. These are universal patterns. These are archetypal patterns. The archetype of war and the archetype of betrayal, the archetype of desertion, all these things that happen in having to fight in battle and all the things that are confronted on the battlefield. These are universal patterns. And when they're not shared into the greater context of the family and the community, in a story that helps people to understand what they did and why they did it, and to be able to share those burdens with them, so they're not having to carry it all on their own. That's one of the primary reasons I think that the suicide rate within veterans is so high right now, is because they haven't been able to have that sense of community and returning into that community to serve as an elder, to share their stories in a meaningful way that gives the people a deeper understanding of what war does and what war can do and what they did, so that they're not having to shoulder all these immortal crimes on their shoulders at the expense of their own lives and for everybody else. And I think it's we don't do that in our society as much. Some of the stories that I heard when my father shared some of his stories to me, there was an immediate bonding that happened. You understand there's an immense love that you have for this person and what they did, and you understand, oh my gosh, and there's a sense of dignity that you feel for this person. You carry it, it gets passed down in a healthy way through the generations. You're able to hold that space in a way that's dignified and filled with respect and admiration. But when these veterans don't get to share it, we don't grow. We just we allow them to suffer by themselves and that's not right.
One of the things that I think is quite interesting is I'm very aware of is that when a veteran has a civilian therapist, such as we do in our clinic at Duquesne University, that there is something much more meaningful happening than merely what our society has called counseling or psychotherapy. That this process by which a civilian therapist is bearing witness to the tale and the stories of the veterans is participating in this ancient archetypal ritual in which the civilian communities are bringing the veterans home through storytelling. That the private grief has to be held in some kind of communal mourning. One of the things about it in the family, by the way, is that then it becomes part of the family's legacy. You know, I think of how blessed I was to have a father who was an infantry officer in Italy in World War II. Have a father who always was very open to me in age-appropriate ways about his experience in Italy, its sadness and triumph and prides and joys and sorrow. His younger brother was buried there and so on. I always knew my father, and from my father's point of view, the memory of that time and of his Sergeant Ritchie and his wonderful younger brother and other people there, that those memories got passed on to the next generation in a way that honors them. And then I think of his brother, who was the silent type, and his oldest son, my cousin, had this feeling of never knowing his father. There's again another traditional story to tell you, if I may.
Sure.
The Shangaan of South Africa used to say that when a man killed another man, he had to, even in battle, he had to build a hut on the edge of his own village in that man's name, and then look after it. And here's the real kicker, is that when the man's daughter got to marrying age, she was then married to the spirit of the dead enemy. And when I was told that by a Shangaan guide several years ago, I was just struck how profoundly, psychologically true that was. I think of all those daughters who are trying to make sense of why they are cut off from their fathers or what's wrong in their relationships. They wonder their fathers might love them deeply, but are withdrawn and blunted and unavailable. And the daughters are so preoccupied with trying to make the relationship better that they're unable to live their own lives. In the Shangaan metaphor, they are in effect married to the spirit of the dead. And for the Shangaan, if the daughter then falls in love and wants to live her own life, her father and she and maybe others in the community will do a ritual in which they will ask the dead to release her so that she's able to live her own life. And I think of how that kind of transformation is worked in the ordinary processes of a skillful psychotherapy too, where we help veterans and their daughters or veterans and families, or just sometimes working with the daughters themselves, find a way to recognize their father's preoccupation with the dead doesn't have to dominate their own lives.
That's incredible. Oh my gosh. Wow. You know, and not having these rituals and not having these ceremonies is such a detriment. And I think there's a really significant impact that happens when we remove these ancient traditions outside of what we're doing in our own modern world and just reduce PTSD to a psychiatric diagnosis. And just leaving it to it's an issue with the brain, which it is, but you're just treating it as something that is a chemical imbalance or a medical imbalance. What are some of these unintended consequences that happen when we just leave PTSD as a psychiatric diagnosis? Isn't there a problem with that?
Charlie, there absolutely is. But before I go further, I really do want to say I do not want to be misled. Mm-hmm. There is clearly a role for psychiatry. Yes. There's clearly a role for medication. And I would never advise somebody to sort of stop their meds or something, like that without it being very carefully controlled and discussed with appropriate professionals. I'm not professionally irresponsible and so on. All I am saying is that if we limit our understanding to the medical model, then we are locked into a perspective that doesn't have much room for the notion of post-traumatic growth, and it also that it misses the moral and spiritual calling and possibilities that are in so-called PTSD. In terms of your question, the primary consequence is that it marginalizes the family of the local community. Because they're not so-called mental health professionals, they feel as though they're not qualified to work with so-called PTSD, which they've now had taken away from them by being interpreted as a psychiatric condition. So it's that marginalization, but of course we can add to it the awful stigma on the veteran regarding mental illness, so on as well.
Well, I think that you're right, and I didn't mean to misinterpret you or anything. There is a role for psychiatry. There is a role for meds. There is a role for counseling and the cognitive behavioral therapy modality and exposure therapy and dialectical and all those things. They all have a role to play. It's just when we detach it and no longer integrate these other aspects of what it means to be human. Well, Besser Vanderkolk says we have to look at mind, body, and brain. It's got to be encompassing the entire human being, not just limiting it to just mental functions.
I would advise, if some of your listeners are combat veterans, I would advise them. There are psychotherapists in the various veterans administrations and clinics, and psychologists and social workers who are trained psychotherapists in private practice. There's some ministers and priests. There are all sorts of people who can help. What if you're with somebody that it's not helping? That's probably kind of because you're not a good fit for what that person is having to offer. And I would say look for somebody else. There are people, and most of all, what you want is somebody who's not afraid to go where you need to go, who's not afraid of you, who's not afraid of horror.
You've got to be able to stand in that.
Who's not afraid of mind-bending grief.
Yes. And that's such an important thing, too, is this understanding of grief. And being able to allow yourself to grieve in those things and understanding the difference between grieving and mourning. Can you explain a little bit about that? Because, and it's right, you have to be with somebody who will not flinch. Who will not flinch at that horror and allow that to be able to tap into that grief and mourning. Could you go through that just a little bit?
Well, the basic distinction is that we think of grief as a private experiential process, whereas mourning is something that is communally held. So private grief is ritually and communally held in public mourning, and we do that on Memorial Day, and we used to do it on what used to be called Armistice Day and is now Veterans Day, but there are other occasions as well. One of the things that I will say about grief is it's interesting to ask, what is the purpose of grief? And I think that in grief, it is the most original way in which we remember the dead. And remembering the dead, which we always do by remembering them at their best, is a way of honoring them. And as the years go by, it is our way of honoring our ancestors. It is also a way of affirming the fundamental and organizing values of our own lives, so that when I remember somebody's courage and loyalty and friendliness, that is remembering and honoring the person I grieve, but it is also affirming those values in the conduct of my own life, which is why so many veterans will have this feeling that they want to live a life that is worthy of their dead buddies' continued presence in their memories and dreams. That was so beautifully portrayed at the end of Saving Private Ryan, by the way, where Private Ryan looks over the graves in France, over the cemetery in France, and wants to feel reassured that he lived a life that was worthy of their sacrifice.
Yeah. Just saying that, just bringing that up brings, my throat starts to get a little choked up there, Roger. Because it's really true. Roger, we've only got a few minutes left.
We're out of time, aren't we?
No, almost. We just got to, if we could do, we'll go over just a couple minutes and go over just some last questions. I'd love for you to elaborate just a little bit about how you work with dreams with veterans, and because you incorporate both the clinical work and dream work, and then just the event that you're going to have at Duquesne on Friday, November 2nd. I know you've got a big veteran event that's there, and for people on the East Coast who are listening to the show who might want to attend, I know that's such a great event that you have about to come up. And then the last question that I would have is one bit of wisdom. I ask all my guests, what one bit of wisdom could you give to this audience to carry forth in their life?
The question of dreams is too complex to answer very briefly, but let me say that I think that dreams, particularly recurring nightmares of the dead, you can help, but you can help put those nightmares to sleep. But you do need to be with somebody who really knows what he or she is doing. Unfortunately, most of the literature out there in the mainstream military kind of psychology literature has no access to this, and they've forgotten the fundamental lesson going back to Freud and Jung, which is that dreams have meaning. And I started writing about this. I have published an essay which can be found on my website, which actually touches on this, and I'm writing about it right now. Secondly, on the 2nd of November, we are having a one-day conference at Duquesne University called Moral Injury and the Role of Community in the Veterans' Homecoming. And we're going to be talking about various aspects of the community, including military sexual trauma in the community of women and the religious community, the legal community and the Veterans Court, and lessons from around the world and local communities around the world. It is free for veterans and their spouses. It is thanks to a grant from the Greer Foundation and from Staunton Farm, so it should be a really fine conference at Duquesne University. And finally, wisdom. I was afraid you might ask me that question. I can't think of anybody who's somewhat less wise than me. But
I beg to differ.
but I suppose I would say that it's something about. I think it was a Sufi saying, which is that God will break your heart over and over and over again until it stays open. Because the wounded heart can either be a place that is frozen with scar tissue and blunts us and cuts us off from the world, or that wounded heart can be a place of opening in which we are poured into the world.
I'll tell you what, I think that's one of the greatest pieces of advice I've had yet on this show. Are you kidding, Roger? That's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Well, I'm also a grumpy old fella. I don't always live up to it, hey?
Roger, Dr. Brooke, thank you so much for being here on the show with us today.
And thanks to you, Charlie, and thanks to all your listeners for listening to us. God bless.
God bless. Yes, thank you, Roger. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into the show and the council today. Here on KUHSdenver.com, KUHSdenver.com, you are hearing the best music, best programs, broadcasting all around the world, and giving you the best shows. They're wonderful people here. I can't thank KUHS Denver enough for allowing me to have this show and to be able to share this out with all of you. Without you, the show wouldn't be possible. Thank you, folks, for tuning in. We are done for today. We will be back in a couple of weeks.
Bye-bye.
And I just wanted to say that the council is adjourned. May you all be well. May you all be free of pain and suffering. And may you all be whole. God bless.
Bye-bye. Are you still there, Charlie?
Just a sec, just a sec. If you say you'll be mine.
Really, this audio was on better. Man, audio was on.
We figured it out.
Yeah, came out very nice.
Roger, thank you so much. Sorry, I had to turn off the sound, and you would.
I hope you didn't lose my picture because I couldn't see you for the last 20 minutes.
No, it was just Henry just came in. He said it was fantastic.
Yeah, it came out real good.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
It came out real good.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. That was great.
I think it worked all right.
Worked out great. Always does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a link where I would be able to copy the link and listen to it again or send it to friends?
Sure. You've got it on the international camera, which is on our website. And then what I do is I save it from there to YouTube, and then I'll give you that link. I'll send it to Charlie. You can send it to
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks a ton. Good to see you again, Charles.
You too.
I'm having another conversation.
I know, it was fantastic. Well, thank you so much. My gosh, it was just so moving.
Good.
Really
I'm
moving.
glad. It was great.
So,
Thanks so much, man.
thank you, buddy. Cheers. Talk to you soon. Oh, okay.
I'll be okay. I'm gonna be okay. I really will be. What was his name again?
Roger Brook. Roger Brook. B-R-O-O-K-E.
I think I misspelled it on the